Okay, this is part two of a series of mini lectures on pre-modern society as an introduction for my students to get a sense of how pre-modern society, especially before 1500, is different from modern life. In some ways, we really need to readjust. Last time we talked about the economy, right? In a modern economy, we get a lot of flexibility to choose what sort of a career, what sort of a profession we want to pursue and to prepare for, whereas in the pre-modern economy, practically everybody is working the land, practically everybody's in farming because it's an overwhelmingly agricultural economy, and we saw some of the ramifications of that. Next thing I want to talk about now is social structure, right? Social structure. How is society organized? How is it structured? And in a pre modern society, again, we're talking mostly about medieval Europe, but also other pre modern societies around the world. This tends to be true. Social structure is overwhelmingly hierarchical, right? The economy is agricultural, the social structure is hierarchical, which means people come in ranks, right? People all think of themselves and of each other as belonging somewhere on a social ladder, and you can tell what rank a person is. That shapes their behavior, that shapes the way people behave towards them. Everybody is very conscious of where they are in the pecking order, what status they have, and status doesn't tend to change very much. People tend to remain in the same social rank as they were born in most often. Um, Different pre-modern societies have different opportunities for social mobility, but by comparison to modern society with its very fluid economy, pre-modern societies generally have much more limited opportunities for social for changes in social rank. In medieval Europe, we'll use this for examples. If you can imagine a social ladder or a pyramid, if you want to, practically every society has a pyramid with a small number of rich and powerful people at the top and much larger numbers of poorer, less powerful people at the bottom. But what exactly makes the pyramid work is going to be different from one society or one era to another. In medieval Europe, at the bottom of the pyramid, most people, those 95% that we were talking about last time, are peasants. What's a peasant? What does it mean to talk about people being peasants? Um, Peasants, there's different definitions that have been used in different settings by different scholars here, so you can explore around a little bit if you want to see some of them. But for our purposes, a peasant is a agricultural laborer whose agricultural activity aims at self-sufficiency, independently of markets. Okay, so in other words, the idea to a peasant on this model is that peasants practice diversified agriculture. They're trying to grow all the food they need to survive. They're building homes for themselves by chopping down and shaping trees, adjoining their village. They are very often wearing clothes that they made themselves or the women of the house made. There's not necessarily as an individual self-sufficient, but maybe at the household level or the village level. Um, they wear clothes that they made themselves out of wool from sheep that they tended themselves, or out of flax, to make linen that they grew themselves. It's sort of self-sufficiency, producing all the necessities of survival. So they have a pretty minimal need to go to a market and use money to buy things. Okay. If you think about a modern farmer, maybe a dairy farmer, the dairy farmer might drink a little bit of the milk that they get from their own cows, but for the most part, they're selling their milk to a market to get money, and then they go use money to buy the things that they need, right? To make mortgage payments on their house or to buy themselves clothes at a store, things like that. Medieval peasant, on the other hand, focuses much more towards self-sufficiency and not on that market. Um, Even within the peasantry, you have a hierarchy. Not all peasants are equal. Some are better off than others. At the bottom of the scale, you have serfs. Serfs are unfree peasants. That means they're bound to the land. Being bound to the land means that a serf is unable to leave their master's land. They have a lord or a master that controls the land that they live on, and they have to live on that land, and they have to work that land, farm that land, and give a very large proportion of their labor and of their produce to the lord in exchange for being allowed to live there and survive there and have anything to eat for themselves. So it's a very heavy burden on the serfs. It may not just be the stuff that they grow that they have to give to their lord. They may have to give time. They may have to go take a certain number of days per month to go work on the lord's land separately from the plot that they've been assigned to. They may owe work maintaining a road or a bridge or transporting the lord's goods to market so the lord can make some money, things like that. So the peasants are under a very heavy burden. The serfs are under a very heavy burden from their lords. Um, at the top of the chain, among the peasants, right, still within the peasant class, but among the peasants, you might have a free peasant. You might have the type of person that in late medieval England they would call a yeoman, yeoman. And a yeoman is a free peasant who still has a lord, but the lord tends to be far away and doesn't really burden the yeoman very much. The yeoman doesn't owe his lord all that much, probably actually owns a lot of his own land outright, and he's not necessarily bound to it. He works it because that's his living and that's what he does. Um, but he's much more in control of his own activity, much more in control of his own destiny, buying and selling land, owning some himself. He only occasionally has to do something for his lord or give his lord something, maybe a bit of a cash rent on some land or something, but nowhere near as burdened as the serfs are. Okay, and you get all different kinds in between, right? There's no one peasant type, but rather, depending on whether you're in 9th century Italy or 12th century France or 15th century England or 13th century Spain, you're going to find all sorts of different combinations of peasants, some of them more heavily burdened and less free, others more prosperous and more in control of their lives. And it's going to really vary from one area to another depending on where you are and when you are exactly. Okay, so that's the peasantry. At the top of the scale, you have the nobles. All these classes tend to be hereditary. The nobles are the landowners for the most part. They tend to control most of the land that everybody's living on and working, and that's their source of wealth. They don't work it themselves. They're collecting all the labor and goods and produce from the peasants that they control who are working it in their villages. Um, the nobles themselves likewise have a hierarchy among themselves. At the very peak of the nobility, you have royalty, like the kings and queens. They are the biggest of all the nobility and have authority to some extent, depending on the other nobles in their kingdoms. And then you have great nobles. We call them the magnates, like magnum, big things. Um, so the magnates, the great nobles, they might be counts and dukes who have control over land that's, tens, dozens of miles across, 100 miles across, something like that, but a great county or duchy like that. And then down towards the bottom, on the other hand, you'll have lesser nobles, right? We often call them the gentry. The original source of the term gentleman is one of these lesser noblemen. And this is somebody who doesn't own an entire county or anything like that. He owns half a village, or one village, or, patches of farmland here and there. He's still a nobleman because he has peasants under him working his land for him. He's not having to labor on it himself, but he's not that much, socially separated from the villagers. So the nobles have this hierarchy among themselves too. Um, the nobles do not work with their hands. That would be demeaning to them and would reduce them to the level of commoners. But rather, their main task is politics and advising kings and attending courts. And they are also a warrior class, especially in medieval Europe. So, landholding, warrior class. They use all this surplus wealth that comes from their peasants to be able to afford castles and swords and suits of armor and horses and all the other paraphernalia of warfare, which can all get to be very expensive. That's what makes them of use to kings, and that's what sort of entitles them and enables them to keep control over all the land that they're in charge of. So you get the peasants at the bottom of the scale, nobles at the top of the scale, and in between tends to be an urban class of merchants and craftsmen, right? Um, it's people, basically the only people who are a bit outside of the agricultural economy, right? Your other 3 or 4%. Nobles are only 1% or something of the entire population. Your other 4 or 5% or so are going to be your merchants and craftsmen. These are your blacksmiths, your silversmiths, your leather workers, your coopers and tailors and so forth, living in towns and who are very market oriented and market dependent, right? Who are selling their goods for cash and using the cash in turn to buy various things. That middle class is sort of a key element in between. Okay, so a social hierarchy from the peasantry at the bottom through the middle class, your merchants and craftsmen at the middle, up to your nobles and kings at the top. And one thing about this social hierarchy, by contrast to, say, a modern society, which is much more egalitarian in its ethos, is that you can tell instantly when you encounter somebody what social class they are. Right, there is no mistaking a nobleman for a peasant or vice versa. You can just tell by the way they're dressed, by the way they comport themselves, by the way they speak, by their behavior, by whether they have a troop of servants following them around and so forth. It's very visual. Display is very important, right, to sort of identify who is who and how to conduct yourselves. If you walk down the street and sort of watch people walking by you, you may, think for a moment, can you tell how much money people make? Right? Sometimes you can, but it's not a huge difference between somebody who has a modest income and somebody who has a rather more substantial income. They don't dress or behave fundamentally all that differently in some ways in modern society, where we much more have a value of equality. A medieval person or other pre-modern person, if you were to say, quoting the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. They would say, no, people aren't created equal. There's a nobleman over there. There's a merchant. There's a peasant. You can see the differences. They're born that way, and they're going to stay that way. Um, Now, in medieval Europe, at least, it's not a caste system. A caste system, like you have, say, in India, is a system where the divisions are absolutely rigid and have strict boundaries between them and nobody ever crosses over. That's not necessarily the case. You do have some room for some social mobility, but it tends to be relatively rare and it tends to be relatively slow. The basis of your social status is mostly your access to land, and the main way people get land is to inherit it, right? So your status is mostly going to be inherited along with your land. Still, there are some ways that people will move up. You'll sometimes have peasants who start getting a chance to do a little bit of trading, and then it builds up and it builds up and it snowballs, and maybe over a generation or two, often not within an individual's lifetime. But a family that had started off as a peasant family farming land may make the jump to being a merchant family. They may start becoming salt merchants or something like that. Once a year, they travel down to the seashore and boil off seawater and make salt, and they bring it inland and sell it. And over time, over a generation or so, that gets to be profitable enough that they could stop farming their farm and move into town and start actually making a living as salt merchants. It's slow, it's gradual, and most people don't get access to that kind of thing. Um, Sometimes merchants become very, very wealthy. They become prominent patricians of their towns, and they can actually make the jump to noble status, be able to buy themselves a castle or, buy their way into court, because they've got so much wealth to throw around. And so you do sometimes have merchant families that will build up to the point that they become noble families. The Medici family in late medieval Florence is a classic example of this. They start off as bankers and they wind up as rulers of the city. So it can happen, but it's rare, right? And that's the thing to bear in mind. There's some social flexibility, and it can vary from time to time and place to place. But for the most part, you're born into a social rank, you live your entire life in that rank, you die in that rank, and everybody can tell just by looking at you what rank you are and therefore how they ought to treat you. Okay, so that's the social hierarchy. Next, I'll take a moment to talk about culture.